Good morning. Today is Tuesday, March the 2nd, and we are in 2 Samuel chapter 21. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 14, and I begin reading. It says, "Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord answered, It is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said to him, We will have no silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall we kill any man in Israel. Shall you kill any man in Israel for us? So he said to them, Whatever you say, I will do for you. Then they answered the king, As for the man who consumed us and plotted against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, and the Mahalathite. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So they fell, all 7 together, and were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured out on them from heaven. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. And David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. Then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, his son, from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up, after the Philistines had struck down Saul in Gilboa. So he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged, and they buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan, the son of his son, in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father. So they performed all that the king commanded. And after that, God heeded the prayer for the land. So we see here that God has removed his blessing on the land of Israel. They've had famine for 3 years. And so David inquires of the Lord, Why, Lord? Why have you removed your blessing from us? And so God answers him. God tells him what happened. That Saul had broke a covenant. A covenant that the children of Israel had made before the Lord to the Gibeonites. He broke that covenant, and God was angry about it. So God removed his blessing. And to make atonement, to cover this sin, the word atonement means to cover. To make atonement, he goes to the Gibeonites. He said, what can we do to make this right, to cover this debt? And money won't do it. You can't give us Saul, he's dead. Give us 7 of his descendants. They'll bear the brunt of his transgression. And I'll confess, I had to do a little bit of digging here, because when you first read it, it didn't sound right. I'm going to read verses 7 and verse 8 again. It says, but the King David, spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. Okay, so we already read that. We already know that Mephibosheth was the boy that was crippled in his feet, and David sought him out and brought him into his own house, set him at his own table, and treated him like one of his own sons because of his oath that he'd made with Jonathan, because they were knit together like this, he and Jonathan. Well, then verse 8 says, so the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul. Okay, and that's, you just have to read it carefully, because we read there's Mephibosheth in verse 7, but then there's another Mephibosheth in verse 8, and they're 2 different people. Same name, 2 different people. The name Mephibosheth means from the mouth of shame. Doesn't seem like a very flattering name, but the Mephibosheth, who was the son of Jonathan, David shows favor to, and he's already adopted him into the house. He's sitting at the king's table. This other Mephibosheth would have been Jonathan's half-brother. So you have the Mephibosheth that's sitting at the king's table, and this other Mephibosheth, who it says in verse 8, is the son of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul. So this is Saul's son, Mephibosheth. The other young man named Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son, King Saul's grandson. So the Mephibosheth that's delivered to be hanged is this other boy's uncle. Confusing when you just see the name Mephibosheth. In one verse he's being spared, and then another verse he's been delivered up. You just have to kind of read it carefully. So 7 descendants of Saul are delivered to the Gibeonites, and they're executed for the sins of Saul. And their mother, the mother of 5 of them, I mean, she's grieved. She basically camps out right there at the place where they've been executed, and makes sure that the birds and the scavengers don't desecrate their bodies for a whole growing season. I can imagine the stench. And David hears about it, and David, what he does is he goes down, he says, I'm going to give them a proper burial. Not only that, but I'm going to retrieve Jonathan's bones and Saul's bones. And he takes all these remains, and he buries them in the tomb of Kish, who was Saul's father. He gives him a proper resting place, a proper burial. And in so doing, he's honoring them. Whereas the Gibeonites treated them as criminals, really. David honors them. And, you know, if anyone had cause to despise King Saul, it would have been David, right? I mean, Saul tried to kill him. But even in this little story, we see David's reverent fear of the Lord. Remember, he had said he would not destroy Saul because he didn't want to touch God's anointed. And so there was a respect that was shown to Saul the king. And even the Gibeonites, it's just tucked right in there in verse 2 or 3. Let me read it again. It says, "But Saul had sought to kill them, and when David said to the Gibeonites, 'What shall I do for you?' they said, 'Well, you can't do this, or we don't want gold or money. That won't do.' But they said that give us of the remnants of Saul, whom the Lord chose." Verse 6. Give him of the descendants of Saul, whom the Lord chose. So even they recognized that Saul was the anointed king. So interesting story. And the question is, okay, is that just an interesting story, or are there some applications for us, right? And so let's, again, put on the specs. When I think about sins to forsake, well, Saul broke a covenant. He broke a promise. He was unfaithful to the promise that was made and sworn upon by the Israelites before God. So the importance of keeping our word. Don't make a promise lightly. So that's one thing I see as far as sins to forsake. Saul had broken a covenant. What else do we see? Are there any principles or promises to claim? Well, I think there's a principle in that God doesn't take sin lightly. I mean, here's a famine for 3 years because God is displeased because of the unfaithfulness of the government, the ruler, the king, and the whole nation suffers. And there's a principle, right? If you're sick, if the head is sick, the whole body suffers. If the rulers, if those in leadership are sick, are unhealthy spiritually, the whole nation will suffer. I've read many different quotes, lots of books on leadership, pastoral leadership, and I think there's a lot of universal principles there. But, you know, one statement I'll make that I'm paraphrasing probably, but the idea is that no organization will ever rise above the ability of its leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And of course, we know Saul's problems. He was unfaithful to the Lord. He was unfaithful to the Gibeonites. He was a selfish person, and the ramifications are still being seen in the nation of Israel. For 3 years, there's a famine, and then David, not really sure why it took him 3 years to ask the Lord, "What's the deal?" But there it is, right? 3 years after famine, for 3 years, David inquires of the Lord, and the Lord answers and says, "This is why." I'm sure they'd been praying that God would give them prosperity, but for whatever reason, there was a famine. I don't know if it was a lack of rain, drought. I mean, who knows? We don't know. Pestilence, but there was a famine, and God removed His blessing. But here's the beauty. David goes about trying to make things right, to atone. And then it says, after all the things that settled, it says, after that, God heeded the prayer for the land. I don't know how, as a nation, we can atone for allowing the murder of 150 million babies. That's just one of the many sins that we as a people have committed here in the United States of America. All we can do is plead for God's mercy and forgiveness. But God won't show mercy, and I don't think He'll grant forgiveness until we discontinue what we're doing. That's just one thought. The applications of this passage are frightening, in a sense, that God sent a famine for 3 years because of something that Saul did, and Saul's already gone. Saul's dead. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, but also is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. That's God's word for today. Are there any things in your life that you need to get right? Think about it. We'll see you again tomorrow.